Paul Gilmartin is the host of the Mental Illness Happy Hour podcast and a former stand-up comic and TV show host. In this conversation, Paul reflects on his childhood trauma and struggle with addictions, and how his recovery has prompted a shift from chasing fame in a compulsive way to finding meaning and purpose in his everyday life and work. Let's drop into the story. So you were recommended by a friend of mine named Val, and she recommended you because of your podcast, the Mental Illness Happy Hour podcast. And I looked into your story, your backstory, and soon discovered that you are the kind of person who absolutely leads with vulnerability. This is a podcast about vulnerability and sharing stories that can help bring new insight to what trauma is and how we can heal from it. So we can jump into your story any place we want, and I'll kind of follow your lead, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, vulnerability. I can't imagine getting any kind of recovery from my issues if I hadn't learned how to be vulnerable. And it was not by choice. It was actually having to deal with my drinking and drug taking, which had become problematic in my late 30s. I got sober in 2003, and it was there that I realized that I'd been trying to carve out a life 180 degrees opposite from what really would help bring me peace. I used to think that if I could be impressive professionally, that would guarantee me some type of financial security, and then that would bring me peace. And I didn't realize, well, who's not going to feel alone constantly trying to distance themselves from their peers? And it wasn't until I had to start going to support groups by my own choice to get sober that I realized the power and the beauty of being one of many, of having a shared struggle and seeing vulnerability modeled by people in such a beautiful way that it made it safe for me to be able to share my struggles. But I come from a long line of alcoholics, high functioning, depressive. I grew up with a mother who had very few boundaries. Dr. Kenneth Adams has a great term for it called covert incest, and I couldn't call it incest until, God, probably 8 years ago. But that was a turning point for me, because what she did does qualify as incest. Some of it was emotional, some of it was physical, kind of under the guise of her caring for my body as a child. But it was pretty fucked up. Pardon my language.
No, you don't have to worry about it with me.
Okay.
One of the connections you made that I don't want to lose is you talked about sort of chasing fame in the first part of your life as the thing that you thought would bring you meaning and stability. And then I hear you making this connection between being, somebody that's achieving some measure of success, but also in some ways feeling even more invisible or more isolated, less connected perhaps than before. And I think that's a really interesting thing. Can we explore that a little bit?
Yeah. It was, I had a moment where, I used to work in TV. I co-hosted a TV show for a number of years. And, it was kind of on the cultural radar, not in a huge way, but enough that, people would stop me on the street. I'd be in the occasional magazine here and there. And whatever little tastes I got of notoriety, they were exciting, but it was almost drug-like in that it would leave me wanting more. And I remember fantasizing about having my face on a billboard on Sunset Boulevard, because I always thought, that means you've officially made it. Well, one year, one year the show took out a billboard with our faces on it, and I went and looked at it, and I just remember I remember thinking to myself, I no longer respect Sunset Boulevard. You
What
know,
was
it's like,
that quote? It was, if there's a club that wants to
yeah,
admit me, that's not a club I want to be part of.
yeah,
Or
Groucho Marx. And
yeah.
it's true. It's that was how I felt. And even though I wasn't sober yet, I thought, wow, there's something just unfillable
Mm,
inside me. And I kind of made a mental note of it, but I didn't realize that that was something that could be addressed
mhm.
later in my life through support groups, because all I cared about was myself. And it's, yes, I could care about other people if it was convenient, but for the most part, I was really, I suppose, like a lot of people who are addicts or maybe trauma survivors, we're kind of in a survival mode where we feel so empty and numb that we need something um, to shock us into feeling something, so it's drugs or alcohol or promiscuity or shopping or, whatever it is that releases that dopamine.
Or
And
chasing likes nowadays, or
yes,
followers. Like, to me, it's
yes,
all part of that same mentality of, get yourself a little drug hit of a social kind,
absolutely.
instead of deeper connection. And
Yeah.
what you said about that was really interesting to me in terms of, you're not somebody who says it's all my mom's fault. And you said when you got sober, you realized the problem was you.
Yeah.
I want to hear more about that, because I think there's something so powerful about saying that, not in a way of blaming yourself, but in
Right.
terms of taking responsibility for what needs to happen in terms of growth.
Yes. Yeah. What happened to me as a child was not my fault, but what happens to me as an adult, how I choose to, to use a phrase, play the hand that I was dealt is up to me. And that's my responsibility. Because one of the things that I did, after being objectified and sexualized as a child was, as an adult, I sexualized and objectified women. And I was a pig. I was a cheater. I'm not proud of, I'm ashamed of the way that I treated women. And my responsibility was to say, well, what do I need to do to not be that guy anymore? And that involved going to a second support group around intimacy issues. And that was where I really dug deep and I stopped minimizing what had happened to me because, in my opinion, or at least in my story, what had to happen was I had to give weight to the things that happened to me. I'd always explain them away. My mom took my temperature rectally until I was 8 years old. And I just remember feeling tricked, feeling like something was wrong. And there was a lot of other things that just didn't feel right. And I never put the entire picture together. I'd always explained one little thing away here and there. And the day that I gave weight to the pattern,
Yeah.
and could really feel that abuse and abandonment and sadness, I broke down and it's like just a volcano of sad lava came pouring out of me. And I believe that had to be emptied out for me to begin to feel compassion for myself, because I had to feel compassion for myself before I could feel compassion for others, because I was so empty. And it wasn't until I began to give weight to the things that happened to me that I was able to really take responsibility and to want to change who
Yeah.
who I was.
Well, giving that compassion to yourself is a way of giving yourself dignity. And from that flows the ability to give other people dignity. But you're certainly not the first person that I've talked to by any stretch. I work with trauma survivors who have had a phase of their life where they use people like a
Mhm.
drug.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
rush, that hunt, that oxytocin, dopamine that gets released.
It's so
Um,
powerful.
it is so powerful, and falling in love, is like smoking crack cocaine.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things in my support group that we try to do when we begin dating is to, you know, be somewhere between 0 and 10. 5 is really
Mhm.
hard for an addict we either want to run or we want to move in with that person. And to be able to say, no, we're going to do 1 or 2 dates a week. We're not going to text outside of the dates. We're not going to jump right into bed. That's really hard. Or to not run away when that person looks in your eyes and you see affection, because for a lot of us, if we were drank in by a parent's inappropriate attention, it can make your skin crawl. It made my skin crawl the first time a woman looked at me with love in her eyes. I remember feeling anger and I didn't understand why. I was in high school and the girl I was dating at the time just looked at me with this nice smile. And I'm so ashamed to say, but I looked at her and I said, what the fuck are you smiling about? I just felt this rage.
Mm-hmm. And what was that rage about if it had a voice? What would it have been saying?
You remind me of my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Get away from me.
Mm-hmm. This isn't safe, or
this isn't
don't
safe.
You dare drown in me, or
yeah, or I'm disgusted by anybody that wants to be with me. It's the country club thing, because in addition to my mom drinking me in with her eyes and spousifying me, there were also backhanded comments. There was a lot of gaslighting. And my mom she's not a bad person. I think she's just a wounded soul who didn't have the tools to cope with her childhood trauma. And so I think I was a thing that she used to get high. I'm sure she would never use those words to describe it because it was, I think, to her version of loving and caring for her child. But it was definitely misguided and not okay.
So what was it like for you to really take in someone's gaze of affection and not be repelled by it? What shift had to happen for you to allow for that?
I had to begin to set boundaries and feel safe in the world. I had to begin to cut toxic people out of my life. I had to work on not being a people pleaser, because if you're a people pleaser, you walk out your front door and you feel at the mercy of other people's needs rather than saying, what are my needs? When a child is emotionally incested, we put that parents' their needs first. My mom turned to me like a therapist when I was 7 and complained about her marriage and how she wanted to leave my dad and leave all of us because we were selfish bastards, and she was sobbing. And I remember feeling like I've got to keep this woman happy, otherwise the family's going to fall apart. Well, your needs go in the back seat as a kid and you begin to stuff things down. So the world, even today, the world doesn't feel necessarily emotionally safe to me when I walk out my front door. There's no specific thing that I'm afraid of. It's just a vague sense of I'd rather be in my house. I'd rather isolate. I'd rather repeat what I know than open myself up to the unknown. And it's something that I work on. But boundaries were a huge part of me beginning to feel safe in the world and to not feel like somebody was going to devour me, to realize as an adult that I do have autonomy. And yeah, there's a lot of things I have no control over, but there are many things that I do. And that was the beginning of me to feel safe enough for somebody to look in my eyes with.
Yep. I've heard variations of this truth from people who have had childhood traumas like the ones that you've described today, how it is vaguely dreadful to be out in the world. It's risky and not comfortable. And that there's this concept I wrote about in a previous book when I was really deeply studying relationships of a shark cage. And really the idea of building a shark cage is about protecting yourself from the sharks that are in the dating pool. I'm thinking about, who is it that I'm getting to know here, and having some protection at first to kind of see what they're up to and what they're about, and if your relationship has the potential to last the long term. And you don't learn that if you don't pace the relationship. So I think
Yeah.
that conscious pacing is so critical to figuring all of that stuff out and keeping yourself safe.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned the shark cage. When I was, I don't know, maybe in my mid-teens, I began to have this fantasy of being. Do you remember the show I Dream of Jeannie?
Sure. Yeah.
And that what it was like in her bottle. She had all these pillows, and it was like a little womb. And I used to have this fantasy that I could be by myself in something like that in the middle of a storm in the Atlantic Ocean with windows, and I would be able to see the chaos raging around me, but I would be safe from it by myself getting high.
Yeah, that sounds like a shark cage of a kind.
Yeah.
With a cocoon of, drugs and alcohol that have the guise of being protective of you, but you know that they were so damaging to you. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, I want to hear from you about why you think it is that artists and writers and comedians often have such a higher likelihood, perhaps, of struggling with mental health concerns, substance abuse, depression, alcoholism. It's pretty well established that a lot of people in those professions may have temptations of that kind from time to time. And I want to hear your perspective on why that might be. Intercountry Adoptee Voices, ICAV, is a global network for and by intercountry adoptees. They provide peer support, educational resources, and work with government and non-governmental organizations to ensure that the lived experience of adoptees has a voice in policy, legislation, and practice of intercountry adoption. Visit www.intercountryadopteevoices.com to learn more about their mission and vision and to access the plethora of resources they provide from the lived experience of intercountry adoption. Welcome back. I'm talking to Paul Gilmartin, the host of the Mental Illness Happy Hour podcast. And we've been having a conversation about some of his early childhood trauma and how it shaped him. And I'm really curious to know, Paul, about this connection that's part of your podcast around people who are comedians and artists and writers, and sometimes the mental health concerns that people struggle with. How do you make sense of that connection?
Well, I think it's something that creative people think about a lot. Where does my inspiration come from? Why this thing? Why is humor so important to me? Or why is creativity so important to me? And in terms of humor, I think people, especially comedians, we don't do it because we choose to. We do it because we're used to having to do it. And it's like for many of us, we were performers years before we ever stepped on a stage. Not necessarily to say, I want everybody to laugh. I want everybody, I want to be popular, rather just a way of dissipating tension, whether it was, we were getting bullied or there was tension between our parents, whatever it was, there was some survival technique to it. And I also, my personal opinion is, when somebody is in survival mode, their brain is revving at an RPM that I think is above the average person. Somebody who's not dealing with trauma or household chaos or, some other trauma or stressor. And I suppose the silver lining to your brain being in that excited state is that you just you daydream more.
You make connections.
You make connections. Yeah, because you want to say, why is the world this way? And I think there's also an inherent negativity, an inherent criticism. And ultimately, isn't that what most art is a criticism, whether it's social or political?
Why is this so screwed up? Like,
why is it so screwed up?
Make sense of that. And it's really interesting because what you're also saying is, I think about Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, and he wasn't the one to come up with this concept, but he sort of made it more famous around the 10,000 hours effect, that if you do anything for 10,000 hours, you'll develop a level of mastery or expertise. And what I hear you saying is that because of the situations that many people who are traumatized in early childhood have to confront every day, they get their 10,000 hours of being, problem solvers, peacemakers, using humor as a way to escape social situations that are really painful, and then trying to make meaning in this overdrive state that is part of the body's response to trauma.
Yeah. It's and you can feel it. I could feel it when it was happening. My dad tried to take his life when I was, maybe I was around 30. So this would have been in the mid 90s, and or maybe early 90s. Yeah, early 90s. And I remember just feeling numb. And I went to get a haircut, and I brought a notepad with me, and it was around Christmas time. And I just remember this poem, comedic, very dark poem about Christmas, just pouring out of me. And it, in the 15 minutes, I think I was waiting to get my haircut, I wrote this whole thing. And I remember thinking to myself, yep, that's how I'm dealing with it. And I think in a nutshell, that's kind of the lemonade that creative people make. And one of the false assumptions that I held on to for a long time was that if I got sober, or I went to therapy, or I went to support groups, it was going to take my edge away. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I can still access anger, but my life isn't ruled by anger. And so as a creative person, when you begin to experience emotions other than dread, anger, and euphoria, which are my three primary emotions before I started to do deep work on myself. Once I began to feel other emotions like peace, or, serenity, or curiosity, or, silliness, I had a broader palette to express myself comedically.
I'm so glad you said that, because one of the procedures that we work with is called stellate ganglion block. And for people who are in this chronic state of overactivation where they can't sleep and they get flooded by anxiety or irritability or can't concentrate, it can help bring them back to a calm state. But the really interesting thing is that the artists that we treated in my network, they have that fear. They are afraid that if they are calm in their own bodies, that they'll lose their genius, that they will lose their connection to their ability to feel things deeply. And that's not what happens. Actually, it's exactly what you said, that when they get calm in their own bodies, they actually expand out into a wider range of more nuanced emotions, and they can still feel things deeply, but they have more conscious control of it instead of it sort of overwhelming them. And then they have to transform that raw pain into art in a kind of compulsive way, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think if anything changes, it will be what motivates us, what our intents are, what drives us. And that may change. You may say, well, I don't feel the desire to be famous anymore. In fact, maybe I don't even feel the desire to do stand-up anymore, but that doesn't mean you won't feel the desire to be creative. And for me, I lost the desire to be a road comic and to be a TV host. And it's not like the industry was banging my door down saying, please come out of retirement. But I started doing the podcast just kind of on a whim before I quit these other things, because it felt like there was meaning and purpose, and like it was something that would be helpful to other people. I never imagined I would be doing it full time. I just thought, I don't know, it feels like there's a need for this and it might be kind of rewarding to do. And so I started doing it. And I believed that if I hadn't been sober and I hadn't been in my multiple support groups and doing that deep work, I would have still been kind of driven by the old model. And I would have never found this meaning and purpose that I get from doing what I do for a living now. Yet I can still be creative, and I still do, stand up occasionally in town because it's a fun thing to do. But I don't make my living doing that anymore, and I don't miss it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So now that you're sort of driving the boat, so to speak, what kinds of things have you learned from doing the podcast, and how has it shaped you?
God, that's such a big question. I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about sexuality in general. I've learned a lot about female sexuality. I've learned a lot about trauma and incest. I've learned a lot about disorders that, for instance, DID and borderline personality disorder. Misophonia, a lot of things that that were never ever on my radar. I've learned that what it's like to the stories of people in the trans community and what they're up against. I've learned a lot about that, the language for referring to people who are non-binary, just so much stuff. I think one of the things that was most helpful to me was to really see that there is for many people, a direct relationship between trauma and sexual fantasy. The things that turn us on. And for instance, I've read so many surveys by women who have experienced assault, consider themselves to be feminist, and yet the thing that they have to think about to orgasm is being violated or humiliated. And it causes in them such shame and such confusion. There's a great book by a guy named Jack Moran called The Erotic Mind. And one of the things that he talks about is that is how and I'm sure this is no news to you, but that's the way that the brain can cope with trauma, is by sexualizing it. And, that brought, I think, me talking about that on the podcast has brought a lot of relief to people who felt guilty or ashamed of the things that turn them on. And I say, many times on the podcast, there are no bad or unhealthy thoughts. There's just healthy or unhealthy ways of expressing them. So, if you have a kink that with a non-consenting partner would be illegal, if you can do it with a consenting partner and role play or whatever, it can actually bring you a degree of intimacy because you're feeling seen by that person and accepted by that person. And that can be really powerful.
Yeah, it's exactly the reason why I'll never go back to a standard clinical relationship with patients again, because doing this podcast, The Story of Our Trauma, like the podcast you do, it's a way to eliminate shame at scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
To talk these truths through in a way that a whole group of people can hear them and say, oh, I know exactly what you mean, or that guest, really that's been my experience, and deeply resonate. So, bringing you on as someone who is on your journey, but you've come to a lot of understandings about your own history of trauma, is such a powerful help to other people that are maybe at a previous point in their own healing process.
It's a good feeling to know that the shit that I went through was not for nothing.
Yeah.
The part that I still struggle with is where I hurt other people, is where I didn't live up to being the guy that I wanted to be. But eventually I feel like I took responsibility for that, not only by admitting my wrongs and apologizing where I could, but by continuing to go to my support groups. And Yeah, sometimes recovery can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I keep showing up, in the 18 years that I've been going to support groups. I've never stopped going. Every week, multiple times a week, I go, even when I don't want to go, because I don't want to go back to how I used to be.
That sounds to me like a really solid and deep commitment to continuing to evolve, as somebody who's healing from trauma. And I know that you and I are both fans of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. And that book also spoke to your soul about how even in the midst of unimaginable trauma, there can be these beautiful moments.
Beautiful
Moments. And I'm so grateful to you, for coming on today and having this conversation with me. I feel like we could talk in a lot more detail about some of the topics that you brought up. But I'll be following your journey as you go forward with your podcast, and maybe we can have another conversation sometime in the future.
I'd love that.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, Edgar Allan Poe, Sylvia Plath, F. Scott Fitzgerald. All highly creative people who struggle with mental illness or addictions. We often make a connection between creative genius and these kinds of private battles. Paul Gilmartin is an example of someone who grew beyond his substance addiction and childhood trauma to find that he was able to experience and enjoy an expanded range of expressive creativity. To grow beyond his challenges, Paul acknowledges that he had to address things in himself that he was not proud of. For example, patterns in how he interacted in his closest relationships. But in doing this painful, humbling work, he has been able to enjoy a type of intimacy that is fundamentally different from the bonds he created before confronting his mental wellness challenges and addictive behavior. He also discovered new outlets to express his talents and has connected with a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. Post-traumatic stress is not a life sentence. Trauma can be healed with the right insights, the right treatments, and the right support. The story of our trauma is presented by Stella. Visit www.stellacenter.com to learn more about Stella's breakthrough trauma treatments. Please share this episode with people you care about who have been impacted by trauma. And remember to subscribe on Spotify and other streaming platforms.